it be nice if people with MS were less prone to something else? Well, I'm afraid not this time. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38 years. I've been putting this one off for quite a while. I've been thinking about doing a video on the immune system and infection and how it affects us. I hadn't really found any good sources that I thought would be good to share, but I've actually been more fortunate lately in finding them. Plus, we have this series going on things that are not MS but can affect our MS that we can do something about. So I thought I would do this video on infection and share with you some of the things that I've seen. So let's take a look at what I have found. Well, I'm wondering, as no doubt you are too, infections happen to everybody, so do people with multiple sclerosis actually have more of a propensity to getting infections than anybody else? Well, I did a little searching out online, and I found an article from MedPage Today, and I'll link it below. It's called Real World Study Shows MS Patients Have High Infection Risks. And the subtitle is Urinary Kidney Infections especially are more common for people with MS than others. And it's by Judy George, who's the senior staff writer at MedPage Today back in March 2nd of 2021. And I'm not going to read all of this article, but I'm just cutting to the chase here. They talk about both outpatients and inpatients with MS and kind of what they're seeing. So first of all, outpatient claims and inpatient hospitalizations for infections, especially urinary and kidney functions, were higher among people with multiple sclerosis than controls, a large retrospective study of commercial insurance records showed. MS patients were more than 4 times as likely to be hospitalized with urinary and kidney infections as others, reported Riley Bove, MD, of the Weill Institute for Neurosciences at the University of California, San Francisco. They also had nearly twice the risk of outpatient urinary and kidney infections, Bove said, at ACTRIMS Forum in 2021. ACTRIMS is one of the big MS conferences that they have every year, the annual meeting of the American Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. Few population-level risk estimates for specific categories of infections in MS patients exist in the United States, she noted. Compared with controls, MS patients had a higher relative risk of inpatient hospitalizations for the following infections: urinary or kidney, pneumonia or influenza, skin, other respiratory or throat, fungal, viral, and opportunistic. Opportunistic means of, relating to, or being a microorganism that is usually harmless but can become pathogenic when the host's resistance to disease is impaired. For outpatient diagnoses, MS patients had a higher relative risk of infections that were as follows: other respiratory or throat, urinary kidney, viral, fungal, skin, pneumonia or influenza, and opportunistic. So those two lists of inpatient versus outpatient seem pretty similar. And now here's a quote from Dr. Bove. We weren't able to go into details about the potential mechanisms for our findings, but 2 main pathways could contribute to the higher risk of urinary and kidney infection, she noted. The first one is use of immune-suppressing or modulating drugs. For example, some of the treatments for MS can result in lymphopenia or hypogammaglobulinemia, which could influence risk of infections, she pointed out. And we have heard this a lot, that if we're taking any of the DMTs that could suppress, like, for example, the ones that target B cells, but any of the therapies that target B cells and reduce them in number, or limit their effectiveness anyway, can also result in a decrease in the effectiveness of our immune systems. So this is something, of course, that doctors would talk with patients about before they agree on going on a particular disease-modifying therapy. So the second, she says, is that MS, despite being a nervous system disease, can result in decreased function in other organs. For example, by causing neurogenic bladder retention, MS can increase the risk of urinary tract infections. Certainly, indwelling catheters could increase this risk. So I think what she's talking about would primarily concern people who spend a lot of their time in a wheelchair or some other position where they're not getting up and they're not able to move about well, or to, in some cases, empty their bladder easily. Urinary retention causes bladder infections. It's one of the causes. So I think that it would be more of a risk for people who spend a lot of time in wheelchairs or are bedridden. But any of us can get bladder infections. I've had my share over the years. So that is just something that people with MS apparently are more prone to than the general population. We also know, she says, that patients with poorer health due to multiple sclerosis can face many barriers for care and wellness, and some may be less likely to see their primary care clinicians and to receive normal screening care. And I think that must be based on some kind of data, but I don't know if it's a good generalization. Maybe it depends on where you are and what your situation is. And then finally, patients in the study had commercial health insurance, and findings may not apply to other groups. So if you don't have insurance, you may be in a different situation because the study did not cover that population. So that, again, it's limited, and that's all studies are limited. In addition, as Bove says, we could not adjust for MS disability levels. So yeah, as I said, we're looking at increased bladder infections, and I'm just going to guess that the greater your EDSS score, the more likely you are to have recurring bladder infections. Another article that I found was in Healthline. It's called 12 MS Triggers and How to Avoid Them. And I have made a few videos on some of these topics, but for this particular video, we're just going to look at what they have to say about one particular trigger that they tell us we should try to avoid. And that is getting sick. Okay, well, we all would like to avoid that. But apparently people with MS have a more urgent reason to avoid getting sick. Infections can cause MS flare-ups, they say, and MS is also more likely to cause certain types of infection. For example, people with reduced bladder function are more likely to develop urinary tract infections. We just talked about that. The infection may exacerbate other MS symptoms. Infections like the flu or a common cold can worsen MS symptoms. Some time back, I told you guys I got COVID in the early part of the year, and really I wouldn't hardly have noticed I had it, except that for 2 days I really couldn't walk. My legs would not support my weight. I understood what was happening because my husband took my temperature and he said, well, you're running a slight fever. It wasn't any big deal, and I was very sleepy and tired. That was about all the symptoms I had, and I didn't have a runny nose or a sore throat or anything else, no muscle aches or anything. But the only real symptom I had was that I was unable to use my legs to get back and forth to the bathroom or anywhere else. So I'll agree with what they just said here because I can attest to it from my personal experience. Now, the how to avoid was a little disappointing because this is the case for everything I looked at. I tried so hard to find an article that would talk about how to avoid getting infections. And, it's just common sense. It's the same stuff everybody does. It says a healthy lifestyle is an important part of treatment for MS. Plus, it helps prevent other diseases and infections. Wash your hands during cold and flu season. I would say wash your hands always because people can be sick outside of cold and flu season. Avoid people who are ill when you're experiencing a flare, and see your doctor if you think you're getting sick. Well, those are common sense, and I'm not going to discount that they're important, but I was, like I said, a little disappointed that they didn't have more to tell us about that. I think, again, as we've been talking about through this whole series, that first piece that they said about having a generally healthy lifestyle, and we have looked at a number of different ways that we can keep ourselves in the best general health possible, that will certainly minimize the risk of infection. It may not stop it entirely, but it will minimize it. It's a good idea, I think, if we just take a look at some overview information about how your immune system functions, because I actually don't know a lot about this, and it takes a lot more knowledge of biology than I've got. But I found a couple of good sites, and the one that I think we'll look at here is out of Australia. It's called Lymphoma Australia. And the acknowledgement here is that your immune system and your lymphatic system work hand in hand. And although we're going to focus mostly on the immune system today, it would probably be worth our while to understand a little bit more about the parts and pieces of those systems. We'll look at this section, what makes up the lymphatic and immune systems. And of course, there's a lot here, more than we're going to go into today, but I will link the site below, and as you can see, some of these items are also hyperlinked, so you can learn more about the different parts and pieces if you want. But here's this diagram over here on the left, which I think is useful. It shows that the lymphatic system and the immune system, they have a lot more parts and pieces than we thought. When we think about our immune system, we probably think a lot about our blood because that's kind of what gets tested when we have MS or when we have any kind of a condition that we're going into the doctor to find out what's going on with us. But here are some of the other parts of that. The tonsils. Many of us don't have our tonsils anymore. I know in my day it was very common for doctors to take out your tonsils when you were a little one if you had a lot of colds and infections of various kinds. And I had mine out when I was 2 years old. And then the thymus is another one. We never really think about your thymus and what it does. The spleen is another place that makes immune cells. And of course, I don't have my spleen because my big surgery a few years ago, that was one of the things that went goodbye. And something called the Peyer's patches. And the appendix, that's interesting. So the appendix actually has a function. You always hear that it's a vestigial organ, but it seems to have some connection to the lymphatic system. Very interesting. And then over on the other side, the lymph nodes, which we know a lot about if we know anything at all about cancer, oftentimes that's where it's detected. And then your bone marrow finally. And that was one I did know about. I knew that your bone marrow made a lot of the immune cells, your white cells came out of that. As they say over here on the bottom, our immune system is made up of the lymphatic system, which we just went over, the physical barriers such as skin, mucous membranes, and stomach acids. Now, there's something I never would have thought of. Antibodies, which are made by B-cell lymphocytes, all white blood cells, including neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, mast cells, macrophages, dendritic cells, and lymphocytes. And I am not going to try and explain what all of those are, but you've probably heard of a number of those, either through your meetings with your neurologist, or if you know anyone who's had cancer, or you yourself have had cancer, you certainly are familiar with some of those terms. Let's just go over some of what they say here. How does our lymphatic system and immune system work together? Our immune system is made up of all the cells and parts of our body that actively protect us against germs or damage that leads to infection and disease. Our white blood cells actively fight germs and recognizes, repairs, or destroys damaged cells. Our skin, mucous membranes, and the acids in our stomach work to provide a barrier that prevents germs from getting into or spreading through our bodies. You didn't know you had to thank your stomach acid to keep you from getting sick, did you? But I never thought about it, so I'm glad to have learned that today. Then they go on to say our lymphatic system, however, is the transport network, lymphatic vessels, and lymph fluid for our immune system, and helps to improve all our immune cells through our body, as well as removing any waste products from immune functions. It also provides the locations in our body, lymph nodes, and organs for the immune system to do its work. And now they're going to go into detail about some parts of the immune system, and this definitely applies for those of us with MS. We really do need to understand our immune systems. There's two kinds of immunity, and the first one they're going to talk about is innate immunity. Innate immunity is immunity that we are born with. It includes physical barriers as well as some of our white blood cells that immediately recognize cells that are damaged or do not belong to us, in other words, germs, and begins to fight them. So we do have some physical barriers. We've talked about some already. The skin, now that's pretty intuitively obvious that the skin would be a major physical barrier to infection and disease. Also the mucous membranes in our mouth and in our nose, our nasal passages, other places. These help us because they allow, as they say, they allow our immune cells to catch and attack the stuff that comes in, the germs and other baddies that come in. It says we have similar mucous membranes that line other parts of our bodies that work in the same way. And here's stomach acids again. If we eat food that has germs, our stomach acids are designed to kill the germs. This helps to prevent us becoming sick or getting food poisoning. And then the white cells, this is the one that we're most familiar with. Most of our white cells, with the exception of lymphocytes, are part of our innate immunity, the immunity that we're born with. Their job is to quickly recognize any cell or organism that looks like it doesn't belong and begin an attack. They are not very specific, but they work quickly. Once they have fought the germ, they send signals to our adaptive immune cells to let them know to come and join the fight or take notes and make memory cells. See adaptive immunity, and we'll get there in a minute, to be better prepared to fight the infection if it comes back. The most common white cell of your innate immunity you will hear about is your neutrophils. These are the workhorse of your innate immunity, but can become low in number when you have lymphoma or CLL. Treatments for these can also decrease your number of neutrophils, making you an increased risk of infection. When your neutrophils are low, it's called neutropenia. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the adaptive or acquired immunity. So if innate immunity is what you're born with, adaptive immunity comes over the course of your life as you're exposed to various germs and infective agents and acquire an immunity to them. It says our adaptive immunity is also called acquired immunity because we are not born with it. Instead, we acquire or develop it as we go through life and are exposed to different types of germs. It is often called our immunological memory because our adaptive immunity remembers infections we've had in the past and keeps some very specialized cells called memory B cells or memory T cells in our lymph nodes and lymphatic organs. And you probably perked up your ears at B cells and T cells because when we talk to our neurologists about MS and different therapies, they're always talking about B cells and T cells. And they go on to say, if we get the same germs again, our memory cells spring into action with a very specific and precise attack to fight the germ before it has the chance to make us sick. But each of our memory cells only recognizes one germ, which means they do not fight as often as the cells of our innate immunity, but they are much more effective at fighting the germs they remember. And this, again, ties in with a lot of what we've learned about multiple sclerosis, in that, in fact, our acquired immunity, our adaptive immunity, the B cells and T cells learn to recognize our own nerve sheaths as enemies and start fighting them. So it's not so much that our immune system is lackluster and doesn't work. It's not lazy. It's actually kind of hyperactive because it'll start attacking things in our own body, things that we need, things that it shouldn't be attacking. It just kind of gets a little out of control. They go on to say the main cells of our adaptive immunity are the same cells that become cancerous when you have lymphoma or CLL, lymphocytes. And then they do talk about antibodies, and here we're going to talk more about the B cells. The most mature types of B cells are called plasma B cells, and they make antibodies to fight infections. Antibodies are also called immunoglobulins. Because lymphoma and CLL can affect your B cells, some people may have lower levels of antibodies and be more prone to get sick. When this happens, you may be given an infusion of antibodies called intravenous immunoglobulins, IVIG, that comes from a donor. Vaccinations work by activating our adaptive immunity. By exposing us to a very small dose or inactivated part of a germ, that is not enough to make us sick. It helps our adaptive immune system to recognize and make memory cells to fight the infection if we get exposed to it in the future. Now, the other site that I looked at focuses more on multiple sclerosis and the immune system as it pertains to MS. It's out of multiplesclerosis.net. So as we go here, they say Multiple Sclerosis 101, Understanding the Immune System. And we won't read through the whole thing. How the immune system works, we've already kind of gone through that. But let's see if they say anything different about white blood cells. They say white blood cells are like the police officers on foot patrol. See, I like some of their analogies. They're helpful to me. They circulate in your bloodstream, constantly scanning for trouble in the streets and looking for foreign invaders. And then antigens, which we haven't really talked about before. Other cells have what are called antigens on their surfaces, which act kind of like a photo ID. The patrolling white blood cells can check this ID and tell which cells belong to you and which do not. If they see a cell whose ID doesn't check out, they immediately handcuff it by engulfing it and calling for backup. At that point, millions of immunologic cops come running to the fight. The foreign cell's antigen is then chopped off and taken back to the lymph nodes for investigation. Sounds pretty hostile, doesn't it? But maybe very effective. Next, we talk about B and T cells again. Lymph nodes are the police precincts of the body, and the police captains are called the B and T cells. B and T cells are made in the bone marrow and mature in the spleen, thymus, and other tissues of the lymphatic system. Once they are alerted that there is a foreign invader, they spring into action. The T cells migrate from the lymph nodes into your circulation to kill off any of your own cells that were infected during the immune response and direct other cells to the scene of the crime. B cells take the foreign antigen that was seized and use it to create a defensive weapon known as an antibody. And now let's find out more about antibodies. An antibody is specifically designed by your immune system to kill off the particular foreign invader or pathogen that it was made from. The B cells then create drones covered in those antibodies and then sent them to hunt and kill off the pathogen. You can see that whoever wrote this was having a lot of fun, but it is kind of helpful. It's a lot more visual. Interestingly, doctors have used this principle to combat the Ebola outbreak. They took blood containing antibodies from people who had been exposed to Ebola and transfused it into others in an attempt to help their immune systems combat the virus. This obviously has nothing to do with MS, but I thought I would throw that in as an interesting example anyway. Like I said, I think they're having fun here. And now we learn how the immune system overcomes infections. Once your immune system is able to produce antibodies faster than the pathogen can replicate and invade your body, the infection is successfully defeated. The immune system has an excellent memory and can remember which antibodies it needs to produce in order to attack certain targets. The second time our immune system encounters a specific pathogen, the antibodies created during the first exposure are rapidly produced again. This is much more efficient than having to create an entirely new weapon, so the immune system is faster and stronger during each subsequent exposure. Therefore, the immune system is able to detect and suppress pathogens before they can make you sick. Now, I realize that these analogies are kind of fun, but maybe what they're really trying to get at is immunity really is like fighting a battle, fighting a war. That the body is throwing every weapon it has at all of these foreign invaders, because if they're given half the chance, they're going to do a lot of damage. The body is aware of that and has all kinds of systems to overcome that. Now, here's where it gets more specific to us: autoimmune diseases. In an autoimmune disease such as lupus, celiac disease, and multiple sclerosis, the immune system makes a mistake in reading the cell's antigens, their ID. It thinks that the body's own cells are foreign invaders, as we talked about before. The immune system then launches an attack against our own cells like it is trained to do to foreign invaders. And then here's something else that we've talked a lot about in MS, the blood-brain barrier. There is a barrier between your circulatory system and your brain, aptly named the blood-brain barrier, which normally keeps immune cells out of the delicate tissues of the brain. In multiple sclerosis, immune systems make their way through a damaged blood-brain barrier, track oligodendrocytes, the cells that make myelin, and myelin itself, and cause central nervous system damage. There is still much we have yet to learn about why this process occurs in the first place and the exact role it plays in MS. But for now, the most effective method we have of preventing further damage is to use drugs that keep the immune system from mounting an attack on our own cells, and many of these medications work by suppressing the immune system. And I think that you know that if you have talked with your doctor about going on a certain disease-modifying therapy, some of them actually do make the immune system less effective, and therefore it makes you more prone to infection. So there are definite things that you need to do. Your doctor will give you instruction on how to prevent or minimize the chance of getting an infection. Well, I thought that was all worth learning about. Our immune system is very complicated and very robust, and even those of us with multiple sclerosis can take heart in the fact that our immune system doesn't work less efficiently than normal. It actually works kind of more efficiently than normal. I guess make of that what you will, but I take heart in it, and now I have a better appreciation for all the components of the immune system and how they work to keep me healthy. And I hope that you, too, got something from this. Leave me a comment and let me know. Are you prone to infections? I'd be curious to know what you do to keep the infections to a minimum. And that's all I have for you today. So take really good care of yourself, and I'll see you again in my next video.